The rain came down in torrents, so thick that it blurred the streetlights, leaving the pavement shimmering endlessly in silver. I crouched under the dim shelter of a forgotten bus stop, just an old bench and a cracked plastic roof, with shadows lingering in every corner of this quiet, deserted place. A strange sense of calm settled over me. It was the kind of calm that almost convinces you nothing could happen. The minutes dragged on, and I was beginning to think he wasn't coming, nearly ready to turn back and disappear into the wet, dark road. But then, there he was, my nephew, standing tall in the rain, his jacket soaked, his calm demeanor almost as though the world couldn't touch him. He'd changed so much. Far more than I ever expected. The last time I'd seen him, he was just a gangly teenager, someone I could ruffle the hair of and tell to get back to his studies. Now, there was a certain presence about him, a maturity that was almost unsettling because it shifted everything. He didn't need my advice anymore or my approval. He had become his own person. Standing just a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine, steady and searching, as if he was looking for something I hadn't realized was missing. "Ever think about how things could have been different?" he asked in that low, almost whispering voice that seemed to carry more weight than usual. The question hung in the air, simple, yet somehow far too heavy for a place like this. An old bus stop in the rain, with no one else around. It felt like he'd spoken into a void, and the silence bounced back with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp. My heart skipped, but I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Different," I repeated, buying myself a moment to process the strange, loaded question. He didn't answer right away, just kept watching me, his expression unreadable. The rain soaked into my clothes, clinging to me like a reminder that I couldn't escape this moment. I felt exposed, as if every detail of our lives were laid out on this small, dimly lit patch of ground, with no place to hide. And then, as if time had skipped a beat, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a simple, quiet gesture that I almost didn't register it until it was already over. But in that fleeting moment, something unspoken, something deeply unsettling, passed between us. It felt like we'd crossed an invisible line, a line we hadn't even known was there until we were standing on the other side. I tried to pull my hand back, to return to that familiar, comfortable distance. But his gaze held me in place, steady and calm, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. The world seemed to stop. Even the relentless beat of the rain softened into the background, barely audible. I couldn't look away, and a wave of confusion washed over me. A mess of emotions I couldn't understand, let alone name. The spell was broken when a car passed by, its headlights cutting through the night, illuminating our faces for a brief moment before disappearing back into the dark. The rain kept filling the air, leaving us standing there in silence, with only the sound of its rhythm to accompany us. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine. A sudden, unexpected reminder that this was real, that it was happening right here, right now. "Do you ever wish things were different?" he asked again, his voice softer, almost hesitant this time. I couldn't answer. I didn't have the words. My mind was racing with 1,000 tangled thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. But one thing was clear, whatever was unfolding between us was far more complicated than I'd anticipated. And as I stood there in the rain, feeling his gaze settle on me with an intensity one couldn't ignore, I realized I didn't want to answer. Not yet. I took a step back, letting the rain wash over me, hoping it might cleanse some of the uncertainty that lingered in the air. But he didn't move. He didn't follow. He just stood there, waiting for something I couldn't define. And as we stood there, caught in that silent standoff, with nothing but the rain and the shadows of the empty street around us, I knew that tonight was only the beginning. The next day, I went to the overlook by the river where our family used to come for picnics years ago. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the main paths, where you could hear the steady rush of water over the stones. The air was crisp, and the trees arched protectively overhead, their branches casting dappled shadows on the ground. I thought it might be a good place to clear my head, to find some peace. But when I arrived, he was already there, waiting. He didn't say a word as I walked up, just turned slightly to face me, his expression unreadable. The silence around us was almost eerie, broken only by the distant gurgling of the river. I paused, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. The last time I'd been here with him, he was just a boy, playing along the riverbank, skipping stones, laughing. Now, he stood there like a stranger, someone new and unsettling, with that same quiet intensity from the night before. "Did you follow me here?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out thinner than I intended. He shrugged, offering a faint, knowing smile, as if he already understood everything. But he didn't say a word. We sat down together on a fallen tree trunk, facing the river. Neither of us spoke, and for a moment, the silence felt almost comforting. The river's gentle rhythm filled the space between us. Yet, even then, I could feel his presence too acutely, as if the air around us was charged. The rain came down in sheets, so heavy it turned the streetlights into smudged halos, and the pavement shimmered like liquid silver. I huddled under the dim shelter of a forgotten bus stop, just an old bench and a cracked plastic roof, with shadows stretching into every corner of this empty, quiet place. A strange calm settled over me. It was the kind of calm that tricks you into thinking nothing could ever happen. Time seemed to stretch, and I was starting to believe he wasn't coming. I was almost ready to turn around and fade into the wet, dark road. But then, there he was, my nephew, standing tall in the rain, his jacket soaked, exuding a calmness that made it feel like nothing in the world could touch him. He'd changed more than I ever imagined. So much more than I thought possible. The last time I saw him, he was just a lanky teenager, someone I could mess with and send back to his books. Now, he carried himself with a new presence, mature, unnerving in the way it shifted everything. He didn't need my advice anymore, didn't need my permission. He had become his own person. Standing just a few feet away, his gaze steady and searching, as if looking for something I hadn't even realized was missing. "Do you ever think about how things could have turned out differently?" he asked, his voice soft and low, yet carrying an unusual weight. The question lingered between us, simple yet impossibly heavy for a place like this. An old bus stop in the rain, where no one else was around. It was as if he'd spoken into an empty space, and the silence returned something I couldn't quite understand. My heart stuttered, but I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "Different," I repeated, stalling, hoping for a moment to make sense of what he was really asking. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there, watching me with an unreadable expression. The rain soaked through my clothes, clinging to me like a reminder that I couldn't escape this moment. I felt exposed, as though every aspect of our lives was laid bare in this dimly lit spot, with nowhere to hide. And then, as if the world paused for a second, he reached out and his hand brushed mine. It was such a quiet, subtle gesture that I almost didn't realize it had happened until it was already over. But in that brief moment, something unspoken, something unsettling, passed between us. It felt like we crossed an invisible line, a line we hadn't known existed until we found ourselves on the other side. I tried to pull my hand back, to restore some distance, to return to what felt familiar. But his eyes held me, steady and knowing, like he understood exactly what he was doing. Everything around us seemed to stop. Even the relentless sound of the rain softened, fading into the background. I couldn't look away, and confusion swept over me. A jumble of emotions that I couldn't put into words. The tension was broken when a car drove by, its headlights briefly cutting through the darkness, illuminating our faces before vanishing again. The rain continued, filling the air with its steady rhythm, leaving us standing there in silence. I could still feel the warmth of his hand against mine. A sudden, jarring reminder that this was real, that it was happening now, in this moment. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" he asked again, his voice softer, almost hesitant this time. I couldn't answer him. I didn't have the answer. My thoughts were tangled, too many to make sense of. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening between us, it was far more complicated than I had imagined. As I stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze, I realized I didn't want to answer, not yet. I took a step back, letting the rain wash over me, hoping it might somehow wash away the confusion that clung to the air. But he didn't move. He didn't follow. He just stood there, waiting for something I couldn't define. And as we stood in that silent standoff, surrounded by the rain and the shadows of the empty street, I knew this was only the beginning. The following day, I went to the overlook by the river, a place where our family had picnicked years ago. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the main trails, where the sound of water rushing over stones was constant and soothing. The air was crisp, and the trees leaned over us like protective guardians, their branches casting dappled shadows on the ground. I thought it would be a good place to clear my head, to find some peace. But when I arrived, he was already there, waiting. He didn't speak a word as I approached, simply turned slightly to face me, his expression unreadable. The silence was almost unnerving, broken only by the distant gurgling of the river. I hesitated, realizing just how alone we were. The last time I'd been here with him, he was a boy, skipping stones and laughing by the riverbank. Now, he stood there like a stranger, someone unsettlingly different, with that same quiet intensity from the night before. "Did you follow me here?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. He shrugged and gave a faint, knowing smile, as if he already understood everything. But he didn't speak. We sat down on a fallen log, facing the river. We didn't say a word, and for a moment, the silence between us felt almost peaceful. The river's steady rhythm filled the space, but even then, his presence felt too intense, like the air between us was charged with something I couldn't explain. It felt as though the air between us had shifted, thick with an unspoken tension neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I could feel him next to me, his presence warm and palpable, and suddenly, lying there on that bed, it seemed like the most dangerous place I could be. He shifted, turning onto his side to face me, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. A strange blend of anticipation and fear surged through me, like I was crossing a line I hadn't even known existed. His hand moved just slightly, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that was unmistakably deliberate. I glanced at him, and for a moment, our eyes locked, holding a gaze that lingered a little too long. There was something in his expression, something deeper, almost searching, as if he was trying to make sense of something he didn't fully understand. Before I could stop myself, the question slipped out. "Have you ever felt like this before?" It was a thought that tumbled from my lips before I had a chance to think it through, and as soon as the words were out, I regretted them. They hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He hesitated, not breaking eye contact, and then, almost too quietly, he said, "I'm not sure, but I know it feels different with you." The honesty in his words startled me, and for a moment, I was left breathless in the stillness of the room. Everything felt too intense, too intimate. I wanted to look away, to break the moment, but I couldn't. Something held me there, anchoring me to the spot, like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and out of the blue, he leaned closer, his face mere inches from mine. There was no warning, no time to prepare, just the sudden awareness of how close we were. I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin, and my heart raced in response. Before I could react, his lips were on mine. The kiss was brief, just a fleeting touch, but it left me shaken, the weight of it settling over me like a physical presence. We pulled back, both silent, and I saw the same confusion in his eyes that mirrored my own. We were standing on the edge of something, caught between what had been and what could be. Neither of us knew where to go from here. Finally, I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "Maybe we should take a break," I suggested, hoping it would ease the tension. "Get some fresh air or something." He nodded, his face unreadable, but as he stood up, there was a flicker in his gaze, something that told me this wasn't over. That whatever had just happened had changed everything, whether we were ready for it or not. The next morning, I stepped outside, needing the crisp air to clear my head. Everything felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't escape from. My thoughts were a mess, circling around the memory of last night, and I felt the weight of a line crossed, even if I didn't fully understand what it meant or where it would lead. I wandered through the quiet streets, letting the coolness seep into my skin, hoping it would calm the turmoil inside. But when I turned the corner near the old bridge that led into town, I froze, shocked to see him leaning against the railing as if he had been waiting there for me all along. I hadn't expected him to be there, not this soon. Part of me had hoped for some space, some time to breathe. But there he was, looking just as lost in thought as I felt. When he saw me, he straightened, a brief hesitation crossing his face before he managed a small, quiet smile. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face whatever conversation was coming, but I walked toward him anyway, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tentative. I shook my head, avoiding his eyes. "Something like that.
Just needed some air."
We stood side by side in silence, the river rushing beneath us, its steady hum oddly grounding. I tried to think of something, anything, to say to break the awkwardness, but the words just wouldn't come. Everything felt too raw, too close to the edge. "I can't stop thinking about everything," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I don't know how to go back now." His words hit me harder than I expected, cutting through me with painful honesty, a reflection of everything I'd been trying to avoid. I turned to look at him, searching his face for some kind of answer, but all I found was the same confusion, the same vulnerability that I felt inside. We stood there, lost in the silence, surrounded by questions neither of us dared voice. A group of people approached, familiar faces from the neighborhood, their glances lingering just a little too long. And suddenly, I was hit with the full weight of reality. I could feel the judgment in the air, an unspoken reminder of everything we stood to lose. I stepped back, putting a little distance between us, hoping it might ease the tension. Maybe we should talk later," I murmured, my voice shaky. "When things are a bit clearer." He nodded, a faint sadness crossing his face, but he didn't argue. As I turned to walk away, I could feel his gaze on my back, quiet and heavy, lingering long after I'd rounded the corner. Later that evening, I found myself in a small, dimly lit cafe just outside of town. It was one of those cozy, out-of-the-way places with mismatched chairs and the scent of old wood in the air, exactly the kind of spot where no one would recognize us. I chose a corner table, hoping it would offer us some privacy, and sat down, wrapping my hands around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. I hadn't planned on seeing him tonight, but after what had happened by the river, there was too much left unsaid. When he walked in, he scanned a room, his eyes landing on me with a sense of calm that felt almost out of place in the heavy silence between us. He sat down across from me, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet, tentative air. The small cafe seemed to close in around us, narrowing the world down to just the two of us at that table. The sounds of clinking cups and hushed voices faded into the background as we sat in the small cafe, cocooned in our own uneasy silence. "I wasn't sure you'd want to meet," he said, breaking the stillness between us. His voice was soft, tentative, and when I didn't immediately answer, I looked down at my cup, tracing a finger around the rim. "Neither was I replied quietly, but I thought it might be easier to talk somewhere away from everything. Somewhere distant from the weight of all those eyes, those assumptions." He nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. For a few moments, we just sat there, both lost in our own thoughts, the space between us thick with all the things neither of us had said. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air like an invisible wall, something both tangible and suffocating. I could see it in his eyes, the same questions, the same uncertainty, the same tension that had been building since the night before. Finally, he took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like we've both been holding something back," he said, his eyes fixed on mine, his gaze steady but searching. "Like there's something we're both afraid to say out loud." My heart tightened at his words. He was right. I could feel it too, this unspoken thing between us. But saying it aloud felt too final, like admitting to a reality I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "Maybe it's better if we don't say it," I replied softly, even though, deep down, I wasn't sure I believed my own words. His gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his cup. I don't know if I can keep pretending nothing's changed, he said, almost as though he were speaking to himself more than to me. I looked away, my chest tightening, the knot growing deeper. It was too much, all of it, too real. The truth was undeniable now. Whatever we had been dancing around, whatever line we had been towing, it was here, and it wasn't going away. I could feel myself rooted to the spot, unable to run, even as the tension between us felt like it might break me in half. We fell into silence again, the weight of his words pressing down on me. And in that moment, I realized just how far we'd come from the simplicity of the past, from the days when things were clear, when boundaries were unbroken, and everything was easier to understand. Now, everything felt blurred, fragile. The waitress came by, refilling our cups, and I mumbled a quiet thank you. It was a small interruption, a brief distraction, but as soon as she left, the heaviness returned, settling between us like a physical presence. Maybe we're not supposed to figure it out tonight. I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. Maybe some things are just better left as they are. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. There was a trace of sadness there, a quiet acceptance that settled over him like a weight he hadn't yet learned to carry. But what if this is our only chance? The question hung in the air between us, raw and honest. It stripped away the last of my defenses, and for a long moment, I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared at him, lost in the depth of his gaze, feeling something twist inside me. I realized, suddenly and painfully, that he had put into words what I'd been afraid to admit to myself all along. What if this was the only chance we had? My heart sank, a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't name curling in my chest. The truth was, whatever decision we made tonight would change everything irrevocably. It would define whatever was left between us, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what lay on the other side. The next morning, I found myself back at the overlook by the river, drawn to the familiar rush of water and the quiet rustle of the trees, hoping they might calm the restless churn in my mind. The memory of last night hung in the air, filling the quiet spaces between my thoughts. I replayed our conversation over and over, trying to make sense of his words, his expressions, the way his question had echoed louder each time I tried to forget it. But what if this is our only chance? I had wanted to answer him, to give him some kind of response, but I didn't have one. Everything felt suspended, as though we were holding onto something too fragile to grasp, yet too painful to let go. The simplicity of my life before him seemed like a distant memory, something I could barely remember, and yet it was the one thing I desperately wanted to return to. But it was clear now, something had shifted. And no matter how much I wished otherwise, I couldn't undo it. I was startled out of my thoughts by the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing a few paces away, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. His face was a mix of calm and sadness, his expression unreadable, like he was seeing me, but also seeing something far beyond me. "Morning," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. "Morning," I replied, feeling my heart start to race. I hadn't expected to see him here. Not after the tension of last night. But somehow, it felt right that he was here, like we both knew there were still things left to say, things we couldn't avoid any longer. He stepped closer, his gaze steady as though he had made a silent decision. "I thought about what you said, about some things being better left as they are." I held my breath, watching him, waiting for more. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, carefully. "I think you're right, but it doesn't make it any easier, does it?" I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. "No, it doesn't." For a few moments, we just stood there, side by side, gazing out over the river, the silence between us somehow both peaceful and unbearably heavy. It was as if we were two strangers, each of us trying to make sense of something we didn't fully understand. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't regret it, he said, his voice steady, but there was something raw underneath, a vulnerability that made my chest ache. Even if this is all it ever is, I don't regret it. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten, and wanted to tell him I felt the same. That whatever this was, it had meant something to me too. But the words wouldn't come. I just looked at him, hoping he could see the truth in my eyes. I think it's time I went back, he said quietly, glancing away. I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a finality I wasn't quite ready to face. Yeah, maybe it's best. He looked at me one last time, his expression soft, almost gentle. I'm going to miss this. Miss us? The words hit me harder than I expected, tightening in my chest and leaving me breathless. The realization of what we were saying, of what we were letting go of, swept over me in a rush. It hit me with an intensity one hadn't prepared for. But I knew he was right. Whatever this was, whatever might have been, it wasn't something we could hold on to. It was a moment, a brief, beautiful, painful moment. And now it was slipping away, fading like a dream that couldn't be caught. He took a step back, his hand reaching out to gently squeeze my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. A wordless goodbye. I closed my eyes, letting myself feel the warmth of his touch one last time, feeling the quiet intimacy that had grown between us, even if it was just for that fleeting second. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving me alone with the river's hum and the ache in my chest. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling a strange peace settle over me. It was bittersweet, comforting in its finality. It was over. Whatever had been, whatever might have been, it was over. But as I watched the river flow, a quiet sense of wonder crept in. It wasn't regret, not exactly. It was something softer, something gentler, like a memory you hold close, knowing it will fade, but grateful for it all the same. I walked away from the overlook, my footsteps light, my heart heavy, but strangely free.